Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's React Online Meetup. We have Mike from Ionic team going to share his knowledge about how you can use React with Ionic, and he will also go over web components and all this stuff. Uh, Thank you for joining the meetup today. With that said, hi, Mike. Um it is all yours.
All right. Thank you for having me. Let me just go ahead and share my screen real quick. Share. All right. So you should be able to see my screen right now. Let's get a quick confirmation that you can indeed see everything.
Yeah, we are able to see your screen.
Perfect. All right. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Mike Hardington. I'm a developer at Ionic, working on the framework. Also doing a bit in web components these days. Something that we're going to see how we can take those web components, add them into React, and make some pretty interesting stuff. If you would like to tweet at me afterwards or get in touch, easiest way to find me is going on Twitter. M Hardington is my handle. I'm basically always going to be available there. So, like I said, we are talking about Ionic and React and how we've been able to take what has traditionally been an Angular-based framework and migrate that over to React, and not just migrate, but add support for that. But to understand how we've gotten there, we need to take a step back and kind of understand where Ionic kind of came from as a company, as a framework, and understand, some of the basics about why we've done Angular only for the time being. So Ionic in its earliest shape and form kind of resulted with the release of the iPhone 5, which dating back to about 2013. I think this was the first time we saw a mobile device that actually was fast performant, had a lot of cool new web capabilities, and really just gave us a sign that this whole idea of doing things on your mobile device and creating web apps was going to stick around for quite a bit. If we think about the mobile landscape at the time, mobile web was really just, we took your entire mobile website, added a few media queries to it, and then just shipped it and called it a day. If you were really lucky, you got a much more specialized version of your website and just shipped it on a m. Subdomain and called that a day. Really, what we noticed while we were starting to build out apps for not only ourselves, but for other jobs, was that the tools that people were using at that time just kind of, it didn't really fit together. You'd grab like 4, 5, 6 libraries off of the internet, pre-NPM stuff. So you were grabbing script tags to random CDNs and shipping things that way. But what we noticed is that there was a lot of manual work going into managing your own app infrastructure versus building out your entire app and shipping something to your clients. So this is what we kind of noticed and what really drove us to build Ionic in the first place. We took all the ideas from different frameworks that we really liked at the time and said, what if we could take all the stuff that is good about it and get rid of all the stuff that we don't necessarily like or isn't necessarily fit for a mobile device. So components that were very specific for mobile, adding things like gestures and custom animations, specialized tooling to make sure that what you are sending to your mobile devices is exactly what they required or what they are going to need. All of that was just provided by Ionic. So, like I said in the beginning, we were built on AngularJS. Regardless of what you might think about AngularJS, it actually was a pretty good framework at the time. And it was a big reason why I think Ionic was so successful at the beginning. By being able to ship reusable components and have this clean abstraction around what a bit of JavaScript, HTML, and CSS is going to do when the developer consumes it, we were able to ship things like swipeable side menus, virtual scrolling, slide carousels, everything that you would expect to get from a full SDK. But just because of Angular, we were able to abstract it down to a couple of HTML tags. And like I said, regardless of what your opinion was, AngularJS just happened to be the right call for us at the time. As we kind of look back at it and think, oh, there were so many things wrong with it, at the time, it really did 90% of the things that we needed, and we were happy with that. But if we fast forward to sometime last year, we were working on our newest version of Ionic, and we started to notice that the landscape had really changed since we first considered AngularJS. The tools and kind of frameworks that people were using and that were the commonplace frameworks were really good. JavaScript as a language also got really good. So it was this really nice time where the language and features that are available in the browser, plus the tools that we were using, are just so much better than what we had even like 2 years before that. So, you know, we were fans of Angular at the time, and we thought Angular was great. But then we also noticed that Vue was out there, and Vue has a huge community behind it as well, and it also has a lot of really nice parts. Same thing with React. React has got a huge community and has so many good things going on with it that it's impossible to just ignore that. And, you know, whatever frameworks that are out there or could exist, they're also really good as well. So it was this really great time where all of our tools kind of got to the same point. And the question started of which framework is better started changing to what's better for my needs, or what fits my mental model, or what fits my way of building an app. So with this in mind, we kind of thought, how do we take all of these different frameworks and start shipping Ionic to it? And we thought about it really, really hard and started actually prototyping native React components for Ionic. And then we thought, frameworks come and go. I was around for a time when Backbone was the cool thing to use, but you rarely ever see anyone using Backbone. We've also seen it with AngularJS. AngularJS was the big framework that everyone wanted to use. Then things moved to Angular, and then frameworks kind of grew to kind of fill up people who didn't want to migrate. So who's to say that Angular or React or Vue are the frameworks that are going to be around in the next 5 years? I'm not saying this to just kind of, you know, say that all frameworks are going to go away, but our tools and our technologies are going to constantly change. And the idea that we could pick one framework and kind of centralize our entire stack around that, it's not a very good plan for the long term. And we looked at it from a really interesting perspective because we weren't necessarily building apps anymore. We were building a kind of meta framework or a design system, component collection. We were doing things that most app developers don't really need to care about. And if you're an app developer, pick whatever framework that you want to use and you're going to be happy. But if you are just shipping a component library, you might not necessarily need to think about a framework or get into the point where a framework is going to be your whole identity. So what option kind of can fit in here and fill the void of a framework-like approach, but without bringing in all the complexity of a framework or any modern tools? or any modern tooling system and build system, and just work in the browser without any additional pieces. And that's web components. Now, I should put a little caveat here: is these are web components that we are building with this little compiler that we call Stencil. You don't need to know too much about Stencil, but I will talk about it just because I think it is interesting how we're bringing web components to React and why it's possible with Stencil. So if web components are great, what do they bring us that frameworks kind of bring us already? Like, why can't we just use Angular or React? Like, well, if you take away the React runtime or the Angular runtime, your components obviously won't work. But with web components, our runtime is a browser. They are built into the browser, built into the DOM in JavaScript, and we can utilize all these kind of these default primitives to build out our entire collection of components and know that they're not going to break when Chrome 81 or 85 or Safari 14, whenever a browser kind of releases an update, we know that they're not going to break. They're also really low level by default. And if you were to tell someone that, oh, this low level API is super awesome, they might think that it's not really, you're not really supposed to be using these low level APIs. But with the fact that web components are so low level and kind of, close to the metal, with air quotes, by default, we get built-in kind of optimizations every time a JavaScript engine is optimized. So a great example of V8 optimized for made an optimization for arrays. So parsing arrays and iterating over them are magnitude faster. Because we're not tied to a particular framework, we're able to get the benefits of those optimizations just by using a vanilla API. And really what it came down to is just they fit a need for us as Ionic, and maybe they could fit a need for you as developers as well, where you can build something that's flexible enough to work across different frameworks and different paradigms and different ways of building out your apps. So if web components themselves are so good, why do we need this thing called Stencil? So Stencil, like I said, is a compiler, which means that we can take all of these benefits from web components and kind of abstract them away into a simpler API. So we take in this kind of meta-programming way of building out our web components, add some VDOM and static types via TypeScript, and we can get this really nice and fast component, and also get all this detailed information about what does this component offer to the, what is this component and what are its properties except as a valid type. If I give a component a property or attribute of color, what are the valid colors going to be? Blue, green, red. We can statically type that and make that available inside of your editor and all of your other tools. It also does this really awesome thing, which I wasn't fully aware of beforehand, where it will normalize the differences between an attribute and a property. Now, this part still trips me up, and I still get embarrassed when I do mess it up. But the attribute being a value that you can set on the HTML, and a property being a class member on the prototype, they don't necessarily have to be the same value. And there's this really good blog post from Rich Harris illustrating the differences between attributes and properties and when those two don't add up and why it can become confusing. With Stencil, we can kind of say if we're declaring something as a property, it is also going to be available as an attribute. And when one of these things change, just update the other one. So we can keep the ideas and kind of patterns that we need to think about to a minimal and have that just work. Plus, we get differential builds and automatic polyfills for free because we know what components what the components require. We know that we can ship an ESM version for modern browsers. And then anything else that uses ES5, we can just give it the polyfill version for things like IE11. So how does this all work, and how does this get us from web components into a React component? Well, let's take a look at what this web component really looks like real quick. Now, for people who have seen some Angular before, or some documentation from views components, we can look at this @component decorator, essentially a way of wrapping our class and saying it is going to be a component with a tag of Ion title. Here are some CSS that we can link into it. In this case, it'll be process and use SAS. And then we're going to also enable shadow DOM, so that way everything is going to be encapsulated. So that way we don't need to worry about our styles from this component leaking out and getting into other components. So we already solved one problem of encapsulation with shadow DOM. We don't need to bring in a new solution like CSS and JS or whatever patterns that you're used to. From here, we can abstract away a lot of pieces to other decorators, and this really becomes the big win in Stencil, in my opinion, was that we can take all of the things that we would need to either expose as props on our component or use inputs in Angular, and we can just say it's a property. We can use the @prop decorator, specify if something is an optional property, give it some type values, so that way we know what we're actually passing by, and then also have event syntax, that way we can emit events out of this component. And then if we want to actually react to when a property has changed, we can use this @watch decorator to listen for those changes and update accordingly, or handle that change however we want. So this is a really nice way of handling the component, kind of how it gets data, how it emits data, all by using just props and events. And for the React-minded folks, the really nice way of how this takes this abstraction and moves it into DOM is through JSX. So this should feel slightly familiar. We have this render function which returns some JSX. In this case, we have this host component, which is our kind of declarative way of saying this is what the component will render to. So in this case, when we say host, we're really referencing that Ion title tag that will get generated later on at build time. And then the rest is all just standard JSX. So the way that we are computing classes, the way that we are handling passing data to passing children down, it's all standard JSX. So with these web components, we're able to isolate all of our components and get them down to their simplest form. Like, what does a title or what does a toolbar need to be able to render to the screen? And then that's all it is. Really cuts down on all the complexity that you can see in modern design systems and modern component libraries, and just gives you the simplest form of it possible. The idea that props are the only way to get into data, or get data into a component, and then events are the way to get data out of a component, are a really simple idea. And you can explain that to somebody really quickly and understand that these things make it much simpler to use. You don't have to focus on how does data get passed in here and how does data get out of here. Props in, events out, and that's it. And really, the decorators, if you aren't really sold on them, you don't have to worry about them too much, because again, this is just web components that we're using at the end of the day. You don't need to use Stencil to make these. You could just use the vanilla API as well. So let's kind of look at how we got these web components and all of our components to work in React, and how's that process actually work, and what does the developer experience look like?
Sorry to interrupt. So can we
Things
say
that we needed
that?
To think about. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say. So I'm new to React, but it looks like it has one-way data binding. Right? It just because you're going one way through the props into the data store, and then from there you are you're not. It's not two-way data binding the way Angular at least was originally.
Correct. So anything that is declared in here, for example, these props, these are all unidirectional. They can only be set and then reflected down. You can't change them and have kind of a two-way data binding as you would expect in Angular. It's also important. It's also kind of important to note that you cannot redefine this value inside of the component itself. It can only be declared or redefined outside of the component class.
Okay.
Did I answer your question? Sound good?
Yep.
Cool.
Thanks.
Cool. So some of the things that we had to think about when we were building this is how do we get React to understand properties and attributes? React has a pretty interesting, it's got a really interesting story behind how it treats properties and attributes. And then also, how does it handle custom events? React's got a synthetic event system and has this whole list of what it allows as events to be declared on a component. How do we work with this and handle all of that? And routers are problematic in the front end ecosystem. We went through a lot of challenges with the Angular router, and we faced those almost the same exact challenges with React router. So routers are just problematic, but we'll look at how we solved it, and I think it solves it in a really nice way that makes working with an Ionic React app feel at home for a React developer. Now, one of the other things that we did have to face with is kind of FUD and people on Twitter. You might think this is funny, but a lot of the comments that people get when you say React and web components aren't web components, kind of dead on arrival. Aren't they kind of useless? Why can't we just use React for all the things? React's obviously better, or web components can only handle strings. Probably my favorite one that up to date was build React into the browser, because the browser doesn't have a good enough component API. What have you, these components are here to stay, and web components are pretty awesome. So a lot of the FUD and a lot of the kind of community reaction to web components is probably the hardest part about selling React devs on web components. Kind of end that side rant, but when you look and build with an Ionic React app, you don't even realize that you are using web components. So if you wanted to get started with this, what we can look at is just our simple CLI. We just start an app and you pass in the type of React. So let's go over to my terminal, and someone wouldn't mind just giving me a quick confirmation that they can see this.
I can see it.
Cool, thank you. What we'll do is we're just gonna run, we'll do Ionic serve. Now this is just going to run React scripts. So under the hood, this is all using create React app as its base for dependencies and kind of tooling on how you build the app, how you serve. So a lot of people have used create React app before, so this shouldn't be too much of a change. And let's see. Yeah, we'll stick with this. So we got our server running. We'll just open up my editor and we'll look at index.tsx. Now this is using TypeScript, like I said. So TypeScript's file extension for TypeScript and React is .tsx. You could use regular JavaScript if that is what you want as well, but I like TypeScript. I think it's pretty awesome. And after a little while, you get used to a lot of the quirks that TypeScript has. But what you see here is that we just have our standard kind of import React DOM, import the app, and render that to root. So what does what does our app actually do? So to look at that, we'll look at app.tsx, and we have quite a bit going on here. Most of this is just imports, which we don't really need to worry about. But we can come down to our main app function, which is really just going to be our component where we can return a bunch of Ionic-specific components. So this is using what we call a tabs-based application setup, where we have a router outlet or a place for us to render all these different routes. And then this tab bar component, which is going to create this bottom tab-based UI for our app. So as we kind of click the tabs and navigate around, we can change not only the URL up here at the top, but have our navigation be maintained as we go through different different tabs. So this is a really, really nice little trick where we're here on app, tab 2 details, go to tab 1, go back to tab 2, and this history is actually preserved, which is a really nice benefit of these tabs. We go to look, say, at tab 1, say tsdef, look at where the component is. We just have a standard React component yet again. Now, all of these components in here are actually React components, right? But if we open up the dev tools in our editor and kind of inspect it, we can actually see shadow DOM and shadow content for content projection or just encapsulation from our web component. So all of this is really just using web components to render our, using React components to render our web component. So we have this really nice kind of setup where the components that you are writing in your React code look similar to what is generated in the actual DOM. So this demo is kind of boring, and it does give you somewhat an idea of what your app can look like. But let's look at a more complete example over here. Serve. Now, this is an app that I've been building for some time and kind of using to more or less dog food Ionic and React. And it's just a quick little music lookup and search using Apple's Music API. A lot of it in here, I am using Redux. I hear it's not the in vogue thing to do anymore, but it still works for me. So in my app, let's see, we just have our app loading up and making requests to the Apple Music API. We have swipeable menus. We have dark mode. Actually, let's go over just real quickly, change those out. Go to light mode. We'll just hide that real quick. We have that swipe menu that you can see you can drag out with your hands. We can go to search. I could search for a band, call Weezer, load up all these songs. Actually, let's check out the Teal album. And we get this really nice material design experience that users would be expecting to get when they load up their app. Now, I thought ahead, and I actually deployed this to iOS, or deployed a version of this to iOS that users can look at. So here's the same exact app being deployed to an iPhone. You could deploy this as a progressive web app or native using various projects that we as the Ionic team have created. But we have this really nice app. It's loading out all these different songs. When the app itself wants to work, here's what we'll do. All right, so the demo on the iPhone failed. I think a lot of it just has to do with the iOS emulator is not that good, but we can see the tabs-based example deployed instead, which should give you the same effect. We have our tabs, we have this navigation layout, we have the animations, which might appear to be a bit jumpy through the stream, but they're really, buttery smooth once you actually deploy them to a device. So all of this is just, the same code base deployed to the different devices, different environments, whether this is localhost or deployed somewhere through Firebase, Netlify, different hosting providers. And it adapts to these different platforms quite well. So we get the best of both worlds of being able to do native-like stuff and also have that same code base deployed everywhere. Let's go back to the slides real quick. So kind of the little mantra that we took with this is, how can we make this work well for various React developers and kind of make it not feel like we're doing too much to go anti-React? One of the big things was just embrace the React mantra and the React ecosystem. By keeping all of our opinions on how your app should be built, you get to reuse things like this, create React App CLI, your own custom tooling. You could eject from React scripts and modify it however you want. We don't necessarily care. We're just another React library that you can use to build out your app. In cases where you might not necessarily need a router, we've actually split out all of that routing logic into its own package. So in the app, in our app, we actually split out what is our normal collection of components for our header, different items, icons, and then we have the router logic split out into its own separate piece, which is really, really nice. Keeps things a lot simpler, and we can maintain them separately without having to release a fix for, well, we broke router somehow, now we have to do a fix for both router and the components. Well, no, we just need to fix the components, or just need to fix the router. We can keep those separate. And then we can automate a lot of these components that we're creating that are React components at build time and not have to worry a lot about them. So what do I mean by this? Well, all the components that we have inside of our React package are actually just this create React component, pass in the tag for the web component. And that create React component function, it's actually fairly simple. What we end up doing is just having this render function where we handle passing the props down to the component, passing any children down to a component, using refs to set up event bindings. And then we can just use this create component and then use the tag name that we passed in to generate our web component. So you get the really nice benefit of being able to write React in air quotes component and then have that work with web components. And React doesn't really care. It just knows I'm going to render this and I'm going to pass the props and children down and call it a day. So this is essentially how Ionic React works. We don't really need to worry about how these components get created. They're all built at a build time through our compiler. And it just works and has built out a good amount of apps so far, and we've been pretty successful with this. So I wanted to just take a quick little break. If anyone has any questions, I would like to take them now before I kind of go over some other thoughts. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I'm curious if you can tell me if there's any public website or app that's built using this framework.
Built using Ionic React at the moment. None that we can actually talk about at the moment, unfortunately.
Okay.
There have been, I can kind of hint at some of the industries, a lot of financial and insurance-based companies One of the things, so I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to know. I understand that you can't talk about it, but just wondering what would make someone pick this. You're so. Forgive me if I got it wrong, but I thought that the idea was that it's built on React, but the underlying framework can change, and we can still be on Ionic, right? We can. So there's a new framework that comes out in the future. Ionic is going to protect us from having to redo everything. But did I get it wrong completely? Or
no, it's not. It's not wrong. One of the big points is we can work with. We as Ionic can ship our components as web components, and then the friction to update the wrapper components or update the React wrapper tends to be a lot less than if we were to completely rebuild our component library using React or using Angular or using any framework. For example, if React came out tomorrow and deprecated a lot of APIs, well, we'd have to go back and eventually update and release and potentially rewrite our entire component library. Same thing happened with us for AngularJS. They released Angular, it's 2.0, and then all of our AngularJS code essentially went away. We eventually rewrote a couple times, and the idea is that you shouldn't have to rewrite the component library if you are a component developer. If you're an app developer and you are trying to create your app and they release making changes, that's fine. That's not like you're trying to rewrite your entire component suite, which could be hundreds, 200 components. And apps tend to be a little bit smaller and easier to migrate that way.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. Please keep going.
No. It was an excellent question. So, kind of with Ionic React, we're able to take, what I think is the best parts of, web components and then mix them with React and create something that feels really at home to React developers and also feels really good to web component developers without having to jump through too much work or jump through too many hoops. These wrapper components and all this, I will add, like I said, was done by hand at first, but is now provided by Stencil in our compiler. So if you are someone who wants to create your own design system or your own internal component library for maybe your company, all of that stuff is open source, and you can check that out and adopt it in your own needs. So why would we want to do this? Like, React itself is pretty awesome. Really, every JavaScript framework is pretty awesome. Why would we go through the work to make sure that we can support all of this and make these wrapper components and make this investment in this API? It's pretty simple. The frameworks, like I said earlier, come and go. All of our framework and all of our code that we could write with Angular and React or Vue could go away in 5 years. And standards are here to stay. They can't remove something from a browser without a fear of it eventually breaking other browsers. The frameworks, they play a really crucial part in how we build apps. So if we can take a way to support frameworks today and the frameworks of tomorrow and still stay close to standards, that's how we can make sure that Ionic stays alive and stays relevant. And it just comes down to keeping Ionic close to the metal while supporting all the frameworks. There's this really nice quote from Nicole Sullivan that I really like. She said at React Rally, "Frameworks are part of the web platform, and if you say that one framework that you're using a framework and someone says that's not part of a platform, that's not really a person you should associate with. Use whatever tools that you want. We don't care. You can use Ionic with Angular and React and Vue, and we still want you to be successful and still want you to be able to make pretty awesome apps without having to go through any hoops to make that possible. So if there aren't any other questions, if you want to reach out to me, you can find me again on Twitter. I'm at mhardington. I will post these slides later on this evening, but if you have any other questions, I would like to take them now. If else, not, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for speaking to the group today.